Good morning. This is Haley Solomon with the North Carolina Housing Coalition. Thank you for joining us this morning for our housing call. And without further ado, I will turn it over to our Director of Housing Policy, Stephanie Watkins-Cruz.
Good morning, everyone. I hope you are having a great week so far. We are going to go ahead and kick it off. We have another special guest this week. We're going to be talking about the National Tenant Bill of Rights that was recently released by the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, the National Housing Law Project, and the Tenant Union Federation. On June 25th, they released a comprehensive National Bill of Rights, but the main objective of this tool was to aim to shift the balance of power between tenants and landlords and redress long-standing racial and social inequities and advance housing justice. There are 7 rights in this comprehensive Bill of Rights: the right to a fair application, the right to a fair lease, the right to freedom from discrimination and harassment, the right to a habitable home, the right to reasonable rent and costs, the right to organize, and the right to safeguards against evictions. And while next week we will be having some guests from the National Low-Income Housing Coalition to talk to us about their process and what it was like to develop this tool, this week we're going to have Nick McLeod, the Executive Director of the North Carolina Tenants Union, here to talk to us about his initial reactions to this tool, how he thinks North Carolina could use some of the elements in this resource, as well as just provide a mini update on what is happening on the organizing front for the North Carolina Tenants Union. So really quick, I'd love to introduce Nick. He's been organizing with tenants for the past 15 years and hopes to for the next 30. He's the Executive Director of the North Carolina Tenants Union, which has local unions in Asheville, Winston-Salem, Charlotte, Raleigh, Durham, New Bern, and Wilmington. Before launching in April of 2024, this year, he was the organizing director here at the North Carolina Housing Coalition, and he spent the past 4 years working with tenants across the state to build their local unions and to come together to build this statewide union. He's originally from New York and learned to organize at Make the Road New York, where he organized tenant unions on Staten Island. And after moving to Durham in North Carolina in 2017, he joined the organizing and capacity building team at the Center for Popular Democracy, where he coached and strengthened community organizing shops around the country. Welcome, Nick. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me. Great to be here with you, Stephanie.
It's great to hear your voice. It's been interesting ever since the Tenants Union kind of rolled off. I get excited every single time we get to be on a call together, so I appreciate you taking the time this morning.
Of course.
So we're going to go ahead and jump in. But before we dive into the National Low-Income Housing Coalition's Tenant Bill of Rights, I'd love for, especially the folks who maybe missed the call about the North Carolina Tenants Union, can you tell us a bit about NCTU and maybe give us a little mini update on the organizing front and how things are going?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to. We already got to share a little bit about our geographic reach. So we have local unions all across North Carolina, and the core of our work is building durable, powerful organizations with tenants so that they can assert their rights. Often that's focused around things like winning critical repairs or trying to stop rent gouging or mass displacement when a building or a mobile home park is sold. And then we're also engaged in several policy fights, mostly focused at the municipal level, because that's where there's a lot of effective policies that we think cities and counties can be implementing to support tenants, and it's also where we have sort of the most direct access to decision makers, and so it makes sense to focus there. And I'll share a few quick updates just from the last several weeks that give a little bit of just a tiny sample of some of the incredible work that the tenant leaders around the state are doing. So in Winston-Salem, with our local there, Housing Justice Now Winston-Salem, residents at Healy Towers, which is a big public housing complex there, I think there was more than 45 residents had a meeting with the mayor where he had committed to implementing a bunch of the sort of oversight reforms that they wanted to see about tenants having a lot more say over how are staff picked for their buildings, and do they get say over how maintenance requests are prioritized and those kinds of pieces. We're cautiously optimistic that he'll come through on those commitments. He's got until the end of the month, so we'll see how that goes. But we're in a good spot there, and I do think that I think those things will pan out well. And then another example is that we've been organizing with folks in mobile home parks in Gaston County outside of Charlotte. That's with the local in Charlotte, actually in North Carolina. And there, one of the really immediate pressing issues that was coming up was folks were dealing with aggressive towing, where folks' cars were being towed from Gaston County all the way down to Spartanburg, South Carolina. And then when they would get there, to drive all the way out, right, you got to drive an hour to get your car. And then you'd get there, and the towing company would say, wow, well, we towed you on a Friday, and it's Monday, so, like, you owe us $2,000 now. Oh, and if you don't have the money, you have to surrender the title to your car, right? Just an absolute abuse of power there. And so the residents there, of course, were rightfully outraged and did incredible organizing work, continue to do incredible organizing work. And a few weeks ago, organized successfully to force their landlord to cancel that contract with the towing company, and are now in the process of gearing up to get into broader negotiations so that they can have a collective lease that says, okay, rather than just the landlord uniformly deciding just totally on their own, you can only have 2 cars per trailer, where there's often big multi-generational families living, or, we're going to fine you $150 because there's a chair on your porch, which is a particular absurd instance. But rather than those being set fully by the landlord, instead that being a process in negotiation with tenants. So just 2 small examples of the many things that folks are doing across the state, to defend themselves and assert their rights.
Wow, wonderful. Thank you for providing that update. And yeah, I could not help but have that sort of visceral reaction as someone who grew up close to Gastonia, and I know how far Spartanburg is from that area.
It's really far. Absolutely. Yeah.
And it's great. Well, that sounds like some amazing work, and that the tenant leaders are doing, and that the NCTU is a part of, and I think is a great example of all the different types of efforts and fights that can happen at the local level. Jumping to, this national tool, this recently released Tenant Bill of Rights from the National Low-Income Housing Coalition. What are your thoughts? What are some of the reactions that you can, tell us about as you read through this tool, some pros and cons maybe?
Sure. The 2 initial thoughts, as I was, and I've gotten to see a little bit of this tool before, and I'm really appreciative of all the work that the folks at National Housing Coalition and National Housing Law Project and Tenant Union Federation did putting into this, is that if, say, we were to implement this tomorrow, right, it would fundamentally shift the power dynamic between landlords and tenants. It would be a massive, massive improvement. And at the same time, so many of the things that are enumerated in this document are things that tenants think they have already constantly, because they're so basic and intuitive, right? Mm-hmm. Like, oh, I should be able to have a clear lease that tells me the terms of my tenancy, right? Or if my landlord is not providing the core services that they said they would provide, then they broke the contract, right? And I get to do something about that, and I can withhold my rent. Not a thing you can do proactively in North Carolina. So I think it maybe speaks to the importance of this, but also the sort of core urgency of it, that so many of these pieces are rights that are so deeply intuitive to folks around, oh yeah, of course my landlord should have to do the basic work of negotiating with me in good faith. Yeah. And in terms of pros and cons, I think, overall, there's something very, very helpful about enumerating these rights and making these pieces very clear. I think that in terms of cons, I'm not sure this is a con to the document itself, right? Because I think that it is actually just a very good assertion of here are some core things that tenants should absolutely have the right to do, and basic protections around. The piece there, and this is something that I think the folks who wrote the document know very well, is always, this is absolutely the right thing that should happen, and how do we get there, right? What's the work? One of the things that I really appreciate about the document, though, is that it includes so many specific protections around the right to organize, which I do think is a really crucial part of that path, and protecting tenants from retaliation. So, I think it's a really good next step. It's a really good North Star. And I think, something that we would love to see many of these things implemented yesterday.
That's nice. I really appreciate that that view as well, right? Some of these feel so simple that I think many people would be surprised that they're not they're not right? They're not protected rights or powers that tenants currently have. Yeah, last question. Absolutely. Yeah, just would love to get your thoughts on how could North Carolina benefit from something like this.
Yeah, I think in so many ways. I'll speak to one piece in particular, which is, as just mentioned, there's a lot of really good protection here around the right to organize. And one of the ways that would really shift how the law currently works in North Carolina is that right now in state law, tenants, there's a protection against retaliatory eviction only if the landlord does not have another reason to evict you. And in a state where we don't have good cause eviction, which is to say that at the end of your lease or if you're a month-to-month tenant, the landlord can evict you without giving you a reason, right? Or where we don't have these protections around clarity of lease terms and the sort of required specificity, and so that it's quite easy for an unscrupulous landlord to find a pretense and say, I'm just going to allege that this person is breaking their lease because I think too many people live in this unit, when actually what's happening is they had a cookout and a bunch of people came over and hung out, right? Mm-hmm. Or I think illegal activity is happening. And you're like, okay, that's a thing that we have an entire system to prove if that happened or not. And it's like, no, we're not going to go through that process. We're just going to assert that this happened and then lead to an eviction, right? And so the shift there in the power dynamic, I think, which would just allow for the most basic protections against intimidation and harassment and retaliation, would make a huge difference and really shift what it means to be a tenant in North Carolina.
Wonderful. Nick, thank you so much for joining us this morning. I know I could talk to you for a whole other 30 minutes. If not more, about this. I think it's really important to look at national tools in this way and think about how it could benefit or fit or need to be shifted, right, for North Carolina and our communities here in North Carolina, because everywhere is different. So thank you so much for your time today.
Of course. Thanks so much for having me.
All right, everyone. So because we are close to the end of time, I'm just going to list up a few things. We are still actively watching and keeping an eye on this pretty dangerous House proposal for the 2025 fiscal year. The bill that was recently released by House Republicans reveals funding HUD, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, at around $73.2 billion, which is still a 3% cut to their critical affordable housing, homelessness, and community development programs from the previous year's funding level. So we have a budget chart breakdown from our great partners at the National Low-Income Housing Coalition linked in the call notes. But I just want to emphasize the point that I feel like we have been emphasizing every year. The budget for HUD, due to the cost of operating programs, just maintaining the service levels, they do require more than a 1% budget increase. But The Fiscal Responsibility Act of 2023 that was passed restricts funding in fiscal year 24 and 25 to just 1%. So there really is kind of this tension in this battle and this continued need to communicate why these cuts are extremely dangerous and why more than a 1% budget increase is necessary just to maintain service levels. And I will say it's quite odd to continuously have to defend this, right? We're not talking about adding service, which is also very much needed. We're talking about protecting those households that are already receiving assistance through these programs and how they would be at risk if this kind of budget proposal made it across. A reminder that the State General Assembly recently adjourned their regular session. They did not manage to pass a budget adjustment that would have addressed the state's $1 billion budget surplus for the year that began last week on July 1st. They adjourned on June 28th, and in their adjournment resolution, they have several dates where they're planning on talking about very specific things, and we're going to continue to kind of follow what they look at, things that the governor has vetoed, election rules, and other matters that they've kind of outlined in the adjournment resolution are things that they can discuss. We have a lot of reports and resources as well as some local highlights and events for you as usual. I just want to list up that our partners in the West are having a Land of Sky second annual Regional Housing Forum. So the Land of Sky Regional Council hosted a Regional Housing Forum last year, and they're back for their second annual forum. This will be August 9th from 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. The doors open at 8:30. Registration is only $20, and it's in Flat Rock, North Carolina. So it's a day full of discussion, networking opportunities focused on housing in the Western North Carolina region. And this year, they are focusing on resident retention strategies, community development, and opportunities for small and rural communities. So the link is in the call notes for you to register. Make sure you check that out. We also have several news pieces that highlight some of the really stark and kind of hard to swallow data that we saw in the Out of Reach report, and just the kind of growing gap between wages and housing costs and how much, right, by area. So with that, I will leave you. I hope you all have a great rest of your week, and we'll see you next time.